Thanks, guys.
Oh, boy.
I understand.
You have enough seats? I think he's okay.
That you want me? I can't find my seat.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Sassanis, and I'm honored to be president of the great University of Delaware. And I'm thrilled today to join our former Vice President, Joe Biden. Let's give him a hand. And welcome all of you and our distinguished guests here and our panelists, everybody, the students, the faculty, the staff of the great University of Delaware in this panel today. This is our first official Biden Institute event, so we're making history today. And our founding chair, Joe Biden, a proud blue hand from 1965, has chosen a perfect topic to get us started. Although the world is facing complex, interconnected, systemic challenges, there is a tendency to focus on short-term approaches to short-term problems. And you know what happens when we do that. The solutions, quote unquote, we produce are short-lived. And pretty soon, another short-term problem comes along to distract us again. What's worse, this kind of thinking has long-term consequences for our nation, our economy, our health, our environment, our social well-being. So we need to reorient our thinking and our policies to take the long-term view. And the University of Delaware knows how to do this better than anybody else. We've been around for 275 years. Next year, we'll be celebrating our anniversary. So we know how long-term investments pay off for our students, our researchers, and our community. It's the only way to make true and lasting impact on the world. So I'm delighted to turn it over now to Joe Biden and our panelists to show us the way from Davos to Delaware.
I'm much more accustomed to going from Dagsboro to Delaware. It's in Delaware. Folks, Mr. President, thank you. I know you have an extremely busy schedule and you have board meetings today, and I want to start by thanking the members of the Board of Trustees here for making my alma mater an even better place every year. You know, all those years, folks, when I was a United States Senator representing the state, friends and people would come to me and say, my son or daughter got into this school and that school or other school. Where do you think they should go? And I always give them the same answer. I said, pick the school they can get into today they won't be able to get into in 2 years. And that's what's happened to Delaware. I'm not sure I'd make it, but thank you. Thank you. And particularly John Cochran, a great friend of mine, chairman of the board, and all the board members for what you do. And I want to thank the panel. Folks, these panelists have come from all over the country and around the world to be here today. And I appreciate the fact that Professor Elson of the Business School, but also the Willard Chair in Corporate Governance is here today, and I'm going to ask him to take on a big chunk of the responsibility to keep this this conference going. Look, I want to be very clear since this is the first event. The Biden Institute has as its objective to make the university a destination for excuse me, scholars and policymakers, not only in the United States, but from around the world, and to expose them to the brilliant young students we have here and the incredibly talented faculty. because I must tell you I have an ulterior motive. I want to raise the profile of this great institution that I attended, and so I thank just by all of you being here today, you've helped me begin to do that, and it's already been done. And the second portion, the mission of the Biden Institute is to influence and share the most important domestic and policy issues facing America and debate them on campus. By the way, an unimportant point, but it's about our attitude here, the President's and mine, is the first group of students I met when I walked in today, I asked if I could meet with the Young Republicans. Not a joke, the Young Republicans organization, because I am of the view that our politics has become much too coarse, and the dialogue between us is not very healthy, and we seldom ever get to the facts. It's always appropriate to question another man or woman's judgment, but never their motive. And once you question motive, you're never able to get to an agreement. And so I want to publicly thank the Young Republicans and the leadership who met with me today. And I ask them for their constant input, and I hope they'll participate in everything we do on campus as well. And what I want to work on, and this is just the opening effort, but I want to work on all those issues that have animated my public life since I was a 26-year-old kid running for the county council. I look back on my career and the things I want to do after having left the vice presidency is that the core commitment from my perspective in building a great country is the opportunity for people to get to the middle class and stay in the middle class. When the middle class does well, the wealthy do very, very well, and the poor have a way up. We are unique among every nation in the world in that we've been a nation about possibilities. President Xi once asked me, I spent more time with President Xi than any world leader, and I spent 25 hours of private dinners with him. We were in Chengdu, he turned to me, and he and I, and each had an interpreter, and he asked me, could I define America? And I said, yeah, I can, in one word, and I'm deadly earnest. Possibilities. Possibilities. And so we have to return to this sense of anything is possible. Anything is possible in America. And that in order to do that, we have to begin to rebuild this consensus that there used to be a basic bargain in America, that if I participated in the well-being of the institution I worked with, or as a business or anything else, I got to participate in the benefits that flowed from that, the profits that flowed from that. We're losing that now. We're no longer the wealthiest middle class in the world, and fewer than 50% of the American people now qualify to be in the middle class. I think it's the existential problem that we face as a nation, and I think that we should be focusing on that. And so this is the first in a regular series that will occur where we assemble the best minds from around the world and the country to discuss the issues that relate from everything from income equality to environmental issues to environmental sustainability, civil rights, human rights, the criminal justice system. And these are the things, as I said, that I want to invite the students. We're going to have fellows that want to work with us. I hope some of you will conclude you want to work with us. But we're going to rely heavily on the faculty, the incredibly great faculty we have here at the university, particularly the School of Public Policy and the Business School in this case, but also all the schools, including arts and sciences across the board. And so this conference, and I'll end with this, is a continuum of what started a couple years ago in my dining room at the Vice President's residence. I got a call from a friend of mine, a former governor of Michigan, who was heading up he was the guy running the fora that is the largest business fora in the country, and they were meeting and asked whether they could come over and see me. And John Engler, Governor Engler. And he brought over many of the people here today, but also Sir Richard Branson and Larry Fink and others, and Andrew Liveris. They were all people like the people assembled here who want to get things done, want to see additional growth and long-term investment, and to see the United States recapture the momentum that it's had through much of the 21st century. And I want to thank Sarah. Sarah, you'll hear from in a minute. She's CEO of Focusing Capital in the Long Term, for being sort of providing the organizational structure for this effort. I had the great honor of 2 years in a row being the keynote and/or the first speaker at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and Sarah organized a roundtable there for we had significant discussion with over 2,800 CEOs in the world assembled there, along with 80 heads of state. And this was a topic that is not only on the minds of people here in the United States, but around the world. And it's all about, ultimately, about growth. And so I just want to, and by the way, all the people who couldn't be here today have committed they'll come to the campus another time. So we're hopefully going to bring you a lot of interesting people who will be able to give some intellectual context to the problems we're grappling with on the domestic side of the equation. And with that, let me say that as we move into discussing, quote, short-termism means different things to different people. To me, short-termism is a characteristic of our economy that incentivizes and pressures executives to put short-term goals, short-term share price, short-term investor profits ahead of long-term prosperity. This problem involves all aspects of the corporate sector, executives, big investors like hedge funds and pension funds, and individual shareholders. I want to see all of these groups do well. They all deserve to do well. But what really concerns me most is how short-termism impacts workers, employees. The building block for a decent middle-class life is a good job. My dad used to have an expression, since he didn't have a job that paid enough to take care of the family. That's how we got to Wilmington back when I was in 3rd grade. He left Scranton. And from that moment on, every time anybody would lose a job in the middle of a recession in the neighborhood we lived in, my father would look at us and say, Joey, remember, and I mean this sincerely, a job's worth a lot, it's about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about respect. It's about your place in the community. It's not accidental, folks, that the only cadre of people in America's life expectancy is declining, not increasing, are white men between the ages of 45 and 55. They lose their job, they lose their meaning. The highest rate of opiate abuse, not among young people, among that age category. The highest rate of suicide. The highest rate of divorce. I can go on. And so all these things matter to not only how we govern ourselves, but how we view ourselves, how we grow, how we stay coherent, how we become one America again. So I'm not making a moral argument here, by the way. This is ultimately an economic one. You can't have a strong economy without a healthy middle class, in my view, and you can't have a healthy middle class without a labor market that both incentivizes companies to build for long run and reward workers when they succeed. It really comes down to what companies choose to do with their profits. And they can reinvest them in research, they can do it in job training, new factories, software, equipment, or they can do it in terms of shareholder payout. There's a lot of discussion here. There's no simple answer in my view. There are good arguments on both sides of this agenda. And with that, what I'm going to do is, as they say in my old place of business, the United States, I'm going to yield the floor. And Professor Elson is going to moderate this meeting, and I might occasionally, which will shock you, interject with some questions. So thank you very, very much.
How in the world do you follow the president and the vice president? I'm delighted that we're all here today. I think the Biden Institute is a brilliant idea for a lot of reasons, and I want to thank President Asanas and the Vice President for coming up with this and seeing this to fruition. It is going to be a tremendous benefit to this university, I'm certain to the state of Delaware, and frankly, I think to the country. The ideas that will come out of this institute, I think, will be very far-ranging and exciting. I'm delighted as well that we're covering this topic as the first real program of the Institute. It's an important topic, not only in the financial world, but really, frankly, to all of us. It affects all of us in many, many different ways. And it's interesting because it's about investment. And it's funny, I always ask my class this, and I don't know if y'all are aware of this. I'm not going to ask the panel. Someone in the audience has to answer, and the president can't because he knows the answer to this. Does anyone know what professional group, what profession is the largest holders of equity in the world? Well, the United States and probably the world. Anybody know? What if you had to pick a profession? Teachers. Not only teachers, university professors, believe it or not. Through TICREF, which is our pension fund, we hold more equities as a group than anybody else. Followed in a nice second, third place, the public employees of California and the public school teachers of California. So this question is not simply jobs, investments on one, jobs on one side, investments on the other. It really affects all of us because we're all investors today in one way or the other. And so the answer to this question, I think, is going to be critical to all of us going forward. I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to do a quick little introduction of the topic, and then we'll go to the panelists for some quick remarks, and then we've got some really good questions. And we got some questions to the audience, too. So we'll hopefully get to everyone. The biographies y'all have, so I'm going to be a little brief. But I'd like to start with Jeff Sonnenfeld, who is the Associate Dean of the Yale School of Management. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say a little more about Jeff, because Jeff and I known each other probably about 30 years. We met at a Renaissance weekend thing when he was a young professor at Emory Business School, and I was in law school. And we've been great friends ever since. And I immediately had tremendous respect and was impressed with him. And to that, 30 years later, it's still the same. The only good thing about this is usually I'm on these things with him. He asks the questions. He asks really tough questions. Well, for the first time, I get to ask him.
Revenge of the nerds, right? Yeah.
Carson Sinovat is with Bridgewater Associates and the former CEO of ATP, and comes to us representing the investment community, and a very excellent representative of this community. He's been involved for a long time, and frankly, the views of the investors on this issue is critical, and we're delighted he's with us as well, joining us. We always have to have a corporate type, right? And Kip Tindall is a...
Kip, you can tell him to go to hell.
I think he's okay.
Very important. But he's the co-founder and chairman of the Container Store. And this is an important part of the equation, too, because it isn't just the investors. It's those who take the money the investors give them to steward, and what they do with it, how they do it, how they run a company, and how does the pressure that they're getting from investors, well, how does that affect the way a business operates or should not operate. So this is
pressure from investors? What are you talking about?
Yeah, you never hear from them, right? But he's a corporate director and a CEO, and we're delighted that he's with us today. I think it's a great balance. Now, how do you introduce the vice president?
No, don't do it.
You don't. You move on. Sarah Williamson is CEO of FCLT Global, which is an investment outfit. She'd been with Wellington for a long time. Wellington, interestingly enough, was one of the first big fund complexes to get involved in corporate governance. They appointed a director of corporate governance many, many years ago, and it was very far-sighted to think about corporate governance and how investments return. And that's really what this is really going to be about, if you think about it. And seated next to Sarah is Mark Wiseman, who's global head of active equities at BlackRock and chairman of BlackRock Alternative Investors. Before that, he'd been with the Ontario Fund. And it turns out we started out at the same law firm, so we both learned good habits at the same time. Again, from the investment perspective, we have three leading investment folks in this room for this discussion. And finally, Jeff Zients was director of the National Economic Council and former CEO of the Advisory Board Company. But obviously, from a public policy economic standpoint, a global standpoint, we're very lucky to have him here, and we're delighted he could join us as well. The topic dovetails very neatly, interestingly enough, with a lot we've been doing here at the university at the Weinberg Center. We've been talking about short-termism and investor activism for a long time. And this is an unusual group to have together discuss it. The Weinberg Center's been around since 2000. Our dean is here, George Watson, who's been a great supporter of ours. And our focus has been on both the capital side, which is the investor side, and the managerial side and the director side. But what this thing does, this panel does, is it brings it all together in one place, which is why I'm so delighted we're doing this today. The story of short-termism is kind of interesting. Historically, you got to go back a little ways. It first popped up as a topic in the mid-1980s during the takeover craze. And it was used as a tool to pass legislation to make it harder to take over companies. And the argument was that those who were doing the takeovers were short-term and focused. And unfortunately, it acquired a sort of a funny rep, those who were advocating it, because typically it was advocated by CEOs, in those days the imperial CEO, of companies that were really protecting, it was argued, protecting turf and protecting bad management as opposed to long-term value. And it faded out from discussion for a long time. But because of that debate, it created the modern shareholder activism movement. That's where it came out of that debate. And the idea was that unless there was accountability on the part of management, you wouldn't ultimately produce long-term returns for investors, for all of us. And the leaders of that were the large state pension funds initially, CalSTRS, CalPERS, TIAA-CREF, and others. And it led to sort of a re-examination and repopulation of the board, how boards work, how they don't work, how they should work, and created tremendous reform in corporate governance. Then Senator and then Vice President Biden was actually active in the area. A lot of the work vis-a-vis Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank, which really put corporate governance in the forefront of the political arena and moved it forward, was really the result of a number of efforts he was involved in. And so you have a role in this too, which is why this topic is really good. But what then happened was, I hope you plead guilty to that, but then what happened was just a few years ago, investment funds emerged known as hedge funds, and they began to actively seek changes in company policy and structure. And the hedge funds themselves came about, you know, a lot of folks say the bad hedge funds. Well, really, hedge funds are really a symptom rather than a problem in and of itself. A symptom of problematic management at a company that would attract an opportunistic hedge fund to show up, to demand change. And the question is, what change? What are you supposed to do? And that's the difficulty. That's the nub. Change, does it mean management change? Does it mean structural change? Does it mean capital allocation change? And that's where the whole short-termism debate reemerged. You know, what are we supposed to be doing? Now, corporate directors have a legal obligation to act in the long-term interest of the company, period. No challenge to that. That's the law. The question is, how do you get to long-term value? And that's the debate. From the hedge fund, it's, well, we want to do X. Another investor may want to do Y. And then the board is sort of stuck in the middle, and the CEO, trying to figure out what and how, and where do we go? Because ultimately, your goal is a productive company and a productive, wealthier society. And how do we all benefit from this? Now, the interesting players in this game, in addition to the hedge funds, are the large investment funds, the index funds, they call them. They invest in everything. And they're the ones who ultimately decide what happens because of the vote. And they are the ultimate long-term players. Index investors invest in everything forever. So their goal has got to be long-term value. And the hedge fund, in making these short-term moves, has to get the approval ultimately of all the other shareholders, the BlackRocks of the world and whatnot, the Vanguards. They're not here, so sorry about that. Forget I said that, BlackRock. But Macy's Kimball's. Anyway, but the point being that ultimately they decide. And an activist fund can make a change on the short term, but unless you have the support of those large investors, it's not going to happen. And we've seen that at Target Corporation. We saw it at Time Warner, where they didn't get the support. And so the question for this panel is going to be, how do we approach this? You know, is the short-termism we're discussing, is it a problem in need of a solution, or is a solution looking for a problem? I don't know. And that's why I think we've got the group we've assembled. Now, it's interesting. The vice president is here and convened this. And as I said, tremendous idea. The question is, how do you order in a panel like this? Many years ago, Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president of the United States, left the vice presidency under Lyndon Johnson and was reelected to the United States Senate. And he comes into the Senate, and the Senate runs on seniority. And the question was, what kind of office do you give him? Because he was the most junior, you don't have a big office. But he was vice president of the United States. So they gave him a bigger office. Well, we have our new junior faculty member here. So, I think we'll give him a bigger office, and he gets to start. Vice President Biden.
The good news is I'm not taking any salary. I'll yield the floor.
Why don't we start with Kip? Why don't you start us off? Just a quick introduction. What are your quick thoughts on this?
Well, I actually think of short-termism on Wall Street and any investment a little bit like conscious capitalism. I mean, conscious capitalism where I think you're sort of optimizing not just the shareholders' return, but the employees' return, the vendors' return, the community's return. In essence, conscious capitalism is creating synergies. And I think what's happening today in business and certainly in retail is that it takes a little while to create synergy with an employee or with a vendor to create that win-win situation. It can't be done with great immediacy. And increasingly, the companies that practice conscious capitalism and take a little bit more of a long-term approach tend to be gaining market share, and those people that take a very short-term, militaristic, you mentioned the concept of a imperial CEO. Imperial CEOs are becoming replaced by sort of something that's maybe best described as a servant leader type thing. Conscious capitalism as opposed to quarterly capitalism, it's pretty exciting. I mean, you see, I think Southwest Airlines is a pretty good example. I think Costco is a pretty good example. Costco happens to pay its average employee almost double what its nearest competitor does, and they do better financially. So we're seeing more and more evidence that type of thing works. It's better for the employee, it's better for the community, it's better for the vendor, and it's better for building GDP. And so it's surprising that the short-termism is actually increasing lately, because you would think with near zero interest rates and that type of thing, and that it would be going a little bit the other way. I think building a company like the Container Store is a lot like building a family farm. I mean, what you do today helps you 10 years down the road. Building that soil helps you 10 years down the road. If you try to force it, you remember the story of the golden goose. I mean, they actually killed the goose to get to the gold inside, and there was no gold in there. But the goose was producing a golden egg a day, and that's a hell of a return for a goose. I mean, you should have just left that thing alone. And Warren Buffett said that he's done pretty well in investing, but he said that if he had done one thing differently, if he had never sold a stock, he would have done, he thought, twice as well. And so, this is a passionate topic to me. I've talked to a lot of people about that. I'm chairman of the National Retail Federation. Most retailers believe this. But how many of you, just raise your hands, how many of you think that generally speaking, a long-term investment pays off better than a short-term investment? Yeah, and so we sort of intuitively know that. We know that in our experience, but we have to tell the investor community that. Why don't they know that? Why, this room's not any different than the rest of America. So it's an interesting topic, and I think that we're slowly producing data to get people to see that longer-term orientation not only yields more benefits for all the stakeholders, but yields a much greater return to the shareholder.
Professor, I'm not going to ask a question now, but later, if you can respond. You said the ultimate goal, you used the phrase, and you said the ultimate goal, and you included the community.
Yeah.
Is that the ultimate goal today?
Should be.
Well, no, well, that's a value judgment you and I are making and Kit's making. So I think we should get back to what is the ultimate goal? Because if you start with Friedman in 70, working your way through over the last 25 years, that's not been able. There's only one goal. One goal. I have in my office, my staff made me kept hiding it on me. I told the guys this before. A picture of a guy from the New Yorker magazine, a great big rotund guy in a black turtleneck sweater, a black mask, and a black beret, and a big bag of money sitting at the table. He's being interrogated. He said, how was I to know he was a job creator?
Yeah.
Because that's where we are today in our politics. The job creators are the shareholders, period. My dad, who sold all those cars, wasn't a job creator for General Motors today. And this idea, we use it blatantly, the phrase, what the ultimate goal is, and including the betterment of society. I hope we talk about whether that's really true.
Well, you know, in the end, you know, we all do better. If you fight over a smaller pie and who gets a slice, the way you do the slices, ultimately you end up with nothing. Ultimately, you hope the goal is a bigger pie and everyone is happier.
I didn't mean to interrupt. We had
no. I want to go back to the investment. I want to go back over to the investment side. Sarah, you want to?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, President Sanas. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for having us. So what we're doing at Focusing Capital on the long term is believing very strongly that this is a problem in search of a solution, to use your phrase, and we are trying to find those solutions. So I'll give you a sense of some research that we've done in terms of quantifying this problem, and it's all on our website if you want the detail, but in brief, we took a look at the companies, large non-financial companies in the United States, and separated them into companies that behave in a long-term way and those that behave in a shorter-term way. About a quarter of those companies behave in a longer-term way. And then we looked at how did they perform on a number of measures for the shareholders, job creation, and all other measures. And what we found, which is a sort of intuitive for all of you who raised your hands, was that the long-term companies had a greater return over a significant period of time. But very importantly, in the financial crisis, they got hit harder. So the short-term companies did better when the pressure was on, and they did that typically by cutting R&D, cutting investment. Those longer-term companies that continued to invest through that very difficult time, of course, recovered much more strongly and returned much more to their shareholders at the end of the day. But it took a CEO or a board who had a pretty strong stomach to do that through that time. And to come back to the impact of this, we said, and we can argue about correlation and causation and all of these sorts of things, but if those short-term companies had been able to behave like those long-term companies in our sample, we in this country over the last decade would have produced 5 million more jobs, 1% of GDP, and $1 trillion in wealth. So we think this is a very big problem. We're very focused on looking for solutions to this problem that are practical. And so Focusing Capital in the Long Term started as an initiative. Mark Wiseman and Carsten Senevad have been involved since the beginning. And our role is to think about how capital markets work and how they could work better across the value chain so that we can create more economic prosperity for all the participants in the markets.
1% GDP, that's amazing. We're only trying to get to 4.
That's
One's
a big
pretty
number.
big.
It's a very big number.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mark.
Well, let me just follow on to a couple comments quickly, and to what Sarah said, and also the example of the teacher. Prior to joining BlackRock, I ran the Canada Pension Plan, representing 19 million people's pensions in my country. Before that, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. So I have a little bit of an understanding about pensions and the importance of those long-term liabilities. But I want to start with one simple idea, and if there's one thing, everyone, I'd like you to take away from today, it's this. Every dollar, every yen, every rupee in the world belongs to individuals. Even those in government accounts ultimately belong to the citizens. Those individuals are savers. And the interest of a saver, by definition, is long-term. Right? Why do people save? Why do any of you save? You might save to send a child to college. You might save because you want to buy a house. You might save because you want to put money away for your retirement, or to be philanthropic, or to provide for future generations of your family. But saving, by definition, is a long-term activity. And what happens to all that money that savers have? Well, it gets accumulated and amalgamated. It ends up in the hands of what we call asset owners, like pension funds or sovereign wealth funds or other forms, endowments, other forms of asset ownership. That money is then contracted out to asset managers like BlackRock or Bridgewater, who then allocate that money to corporations by and large for those corporations to put to productive use. Those corporations are governed by boards of directors, managed by management teams and executives. And if it all works well, that money through the end of the chain eventually comes back to the saver in due time. In that value chain, something is broken. Because by the time it gets to the corporation, to the manager of the corporation who is allocating that capital, the saver's capital, it's being used for very short-term purposes. And those short-term purposes are anathema to the act of what the saver wants, which is a long-term return on his or her investment. So for example, in one study, it showed that 55% of S&P 500 CFOs admitted that they would forego an NPV, a net present value positive project, if they were going to miss next quarter's earnings by 1 cent. So we had CFOs admitting that they were essentially willing to destroy shareholder value because of 1 cent on quarterly earnings. And so the question for us, and the work that Sarah is doing is so important to this, is to say, how can we ensure that that value chain is aligned? And we think, the work that we've done, that there's two places that are particularly important. What's particularly important is that contracting between asset owners and asset managers, making sure that we get the right alignment there. And secondly, the role of boards, and making sure that boards whose interest is the shareholder, at least in Delaware it is, that boards are truly making decisions in the long-term interest of those shareholders. And so those are the 2 points on that value chain that we're most focused on in trying to address this issue. But really, it's bizarre because the ultimate owners of the world's corporations are all of us and all the teachers and all the university professors and everyone else. And yet these corporations aren't working in our economic interest. We don't even have to talk about the externalities of jobs and the environment and everything else. They're not working in our basic economic interest, and that's what we've got to fix, first and foremost.
Good job.
Like before, that's one of the reasons why directors today, for a number of years, are required to own lots of stock that they can't sell while they remain on the board, to give them a 10, 15-year time horizon that they are investing, or as directors, their interests are allied with the long-term holders of the company. You'd hope that directors would pay attention to that and not focus on the 1 cent a share, because if they're there for 15 years or 20 years with holdings that company, they want long-term growth. Jeff, and then I'll come to the other Jeff.
So before I stepped into the West Wing to interview with the Vice President 8.5 years ago, I'd never set foot in government. I'd been in business and was lucky enough to join a very fast-growing company and then eventually help lead it. We went public after about 10 years with 2 different companies. And I can remember that experience of going public. It was exciting, it was scary. And it actually, I think, was net helpful for us growing and investing in our employees because of the pace of the public markets. I think, and I don't know exactly how it fits into your time frame, this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. As I've been in government for the last 8.5 years, I think things have accelerated in terms of that pacing and that insistence on the quarter to a point where at times it can be dysfunctional. So in your example of 1 penny, you can see companies that can trade down 5 or 10% because they miss their earnings by 1 penny. So I think we've gotten to a point where that pacing sometimes is dysfunctional. There's too much focus on short-termism. Yet there are so many leaders in the corporate setting, like Kip, investors. We have a great panel here today of leaders that are doing the right thing. So the tricky thing is from a public policy perspective is, where are the policy solutions, or are there policy solutions? We looked a lot at this. The Vice President and the President had us very focused on this across the last year, and there aren't obvious policy solutions. They're obvious policy solutions for covering more people with health care. That's pretty darn obvious to me. But here it's more nuanced, it's more difficult. And I'm looking forward to today because it's an opportunity to hear from leaders who are on the front line. And I know that is a big opportunity for us, for people like this to get together and talk about how important this is and where the levers are. But I'm also interested in hearing and talking through, are there public policy solutions in areas like encouraging investment in employees, in the tax code? Are there ways to incent more long-term investment? Should we be looking at how people are compensated to ensure that they are focused on the long term? So thank you for having me here. This is my 4th college visit in the last 100 days. I actually live in Washington, D.C. I can't tell you how great it is to get out of Washington, D.C., to get on a college campus, because you leave inevitably very optimistic about our future because of all of you. So thank you.
Well, I hope you like this one the best.
Yes.
I want to make a 30-second interjection here. We spent, Jeff and I and the economic team and the president, in the Roosevelt room, hours and hours and hours, acknowledging the problem, looking for policy solutions. And Jeff may remember at one point I said, it reminds me of something G.K. Chesterton once said. It's not that Christianity's been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried. That's kind of where we are in a policy perspective.
Well captured.
Jeff, you're the academic. You're the cleanup guy. You want to clean us up?
Well,
That's not a tough question.
I will say that Carson thinks he's off the hook. Of course, right? You've not spoken, right? So he would be the cleanup guy.
Oh,
but
gosh, Carson, may I?
Oh, sure. I was
You know,
actually looking to steal Carson's notes, but they're all in
Yeah,
Danish.
that's why I took them over here. I saw you copying.
They are in Danish.
Carson, please.
You know,
If this is the biggest slip up of the day, I'm okay. Please, Carson.
let me tell you about a performance review that I had about 5 years ago. I had just taken over the role as CEO of ATP, which is the mandatory pension plan for all Danes. So literally every Danish citizen is a member of this pension plan. Before I tell you about the day, that performance review, just winding back, I had spent my career up until then in New York and on Wall Street and in consulting firms in fairly intense performance environments. So I thought I was used to all types of performance reviews. This particular performance review happened on my first day and was in the cab ride on the way home from my first day. And the cab driver looked in the mirror, and it being a small country, people basically know everyone. And so he looked in the mirror and he said, you know, it's my money. Are you taking good care of it? Because I need to retire in 5 years.
Did you give him a good tip?
Well, I gave him a big raise after a couple of years when he became a pensioner. But the first question really hit me was, you know, the livelihood of this individual and basically of all pensioners relies on how we invest. So the fiduciary responsibilities they're real. But his second question was, will you behave? I mean, will you behave in this role? Will you make us proud? Which really goes to the issue of, are you a constructive member of society? And those two questions, will you make sure to make enough money so that I have a good pension? And two, will you behave? That basically, in my mind, sums up the challenge that you sit with when you're an asset owner. In fact, any type of investor, but in particular, as Mark was saying, for the asset owners, because they're the ones who most directly represent the people whose money it is. Yeah. And when you think about those two goals, making money and really being, you said conscious, people have different words for it, I call it being constructive member. One of the biggest enemies of that is the short-termism. And I think we've had great conversations about why that's bad. But the more I thought about the need for reconciling these two goals and the challenge of short-termism, there were three paradoxes that occurred to me. The first one was, why is it even a trade-off? Because most of the investors or entrepreneurs or corporate leaders that I admire and that I think have been very, very successful tended to be the ones who had a long-term focus. I can speak at length to anyone who is more on the financial geeky side about a lot of the theory around risk premiums and how you invest them, how you capture them, and most of it says it's over long periods of time. So paradox one was actually long-term is good for me as an investor. And so paradox two was if it's both good for me and it's also good for kind of to be constructive, it kind of leads to the third question was who's against this? But we must recognize that when the research that Mark and Sarah and others have quoted, that there's something in the system that despite everyone or most people actually wanting to have a long-term focus, there's some types of breakdown. And I think the good news is that actually just focusing on this topic and having more and more discussions around it, I think that in of itself is positive. As part of the initiative on focusing capital on the long term, you know, when you have in a way a conundrum like this, it's easy always to point to the other people and say, well, it's kind of other people need to do something. It's the media, it's the investors over there, it's somebody else's fault. But one of the things that we tried to do as part of this initiative was in a way to look at what could we do ourselves. And in fact, especially among the asset owners, in other words, the big pools of capital that in a way control most of the money, there were a number of things that could be done. Looking at how we evaluate ourselves, how I'm being evaluated, how my team is being evaluated, how do we evaluate people who manage money for us? So there were actually a number of things that we could change and that were changed, and I think is being changed, that can start help shifting this conundrum, or shift this debate, and really in a way just reconcile the fact that the more long-term you are, the better it is as an investor, and the more positive side benefits you can have.
Thank you.
Jeff, you always make me nervous. There, look, you did it again. I slipped up. Go ahead, please.
I make him nervous, which is why he always leaves me for the cleanup spot. But usually when I'm on a panel with Charles, there really is a lot to clean up. I usually...
See, I knew he was going to do it.
It's not because of anything Charles deposited, but it has a lot to do with the portfolio of people that we're seated with, because I usually stand in sharp disagreement with my fellow panelists on a topic like this. I usually feel like the proverbial mosquito in a nudist colony not knowing where to bite first. In this case, the great frustration is just the opposite. I completely agree with what everybody said. But obviously the last speaker knows it still hasn't been said by everybody. So let me say some of these things in a little bit different way. And that is, I not only feel like I have a lot in common with the panel, I feel like I have a lot in common with this university and the vice president. How could that be? A little dirty secret just between us in this room. We all started out as Pennsylvanians. Yes, this university was founded 274 years ago, but in a different state. And where I was born, and where the vice president was born, and moved here, but it moved here not because necessarily of its own free will, but because of a distortion of the market. The great Benjamin Franklin, the university he created, was threatened by you folks. So you thought, the heck with it, then we'll come here. So when you think about it, what a great place to be looking at long-term, short-term perspectives is, rather than short-term obstacles get in the way of this great institution of learning, 274 years ago, you thought, we'll just reinvent ourselves. And then a century after that, unlike other private universities, you saw public universities and the opportunity of the land grant, the Morrill Act, to become a land-grant university, thinking, you know, serving society is not such a bad thing for the ivory tower either. Who as a private university did that? A century later, you did that. And then, in the lifetime of everybody in this room, and in fact, the careers of all of we old-timers on this panel, is you went off and reinvented yourselves again when Chrysler created this great tract of land for something to be brought back to life. And once again, this great university seized that moment to reinvent opportunities for the future. So here, this 274-year-old school, and Dr. Ostanos, you don't look a year older than 273 to me, but you look pretty good, is ageless. So as old as it is, it's as fresh and young as can be. And I think that's so much to admire. But Also, talk about ageless, of course. The namesake of this institute is as ageless. There's no fresher, younger mind in the room than, of course, Vice President Biden is. It was Baruch Spinoza who said that citizenship is not born, but it's earned. This man has earned citizenship so many ways over for everybody in this room, no matter where you're from, that if you're in the presence of this man, we feel like we're a great citizen. So what a great institute to take on this ageless battle and reinvent itself. But the Vice President mentioned some other names. In fact, of course, he doesn't refer to himself, but he referred to Andrew Livers. I think was one of the names you mentioned, one of the CEOs. And you could put on that list in the day's headlines, Klaus Kleinfeld of Alcoa, then Arconic, who's just lost his job last week because of the issues we're looking at today. A great friend, and many in this room may know her, Ellen Coleman of DuPont, of course, in a similar plight. You could add Michael Dell facing such pressures as he's running Dell, Tim Cook of Apple, Indra Nooyi of PepsiCo. You could add in John Mackey, your friend of Whole Foods, and we could add what do you have in common between these names I throw out there? They're not just names that are perhaps friends of the Vice President. They also happen to be some of the greatest conscious capitalists, whether or not they're formal members or not, but looking at a holistic view of society with spectacular performance in each of their companies. And they've all been targeted by activists. The only thing I would disagree that Charles said is about performance gaps creating an opportunity for what are the best solutions. There are no performance gaps here. The only other thing these people all have in common with one another, other than they happen to be Americans, is, and they all were targeted by activists, is every single one of them led companies which during their reign, the performance of those companies towered over the performance of the very activists coming after them. The dirty secret is these activist funds, their performance in the short term is not good. And in the long term, it's been horrendous. There are distortions in the data, maybe in a panel or some other time, we can talk about the data distortions long term. But short term, if you just look at the last 7, 8 years, if you put your money in the average activist, not just any hedge fund, the activist hedge fund, the high profile bullies you read about, last 8 years, you'd get a 19% return. If you put that money just in S&P 500, you'd get a 65% return. To your point about long-term investing, what's going on there? Why are the pension funds falling victims to this stuff? That's the short-term stuff. Long-term, of course, what we're saying, eating the seed capital, is a huge problem. Now, if you take a look at the latest survey of institutional investors, 100% of them say they're disappointed with the returns they're getting. Why are they doing this? It's a hard thing. It's very perplexing to me. Some of it is the bravado. Some of it is these people with tiny, very slender ownership stakes want to take full control of the boards, and the boards are becoming weak-kneed, such as DuPont's board, not to offend anybody in the room, or Arconic's board more recently, falling victim to these bullies with a tiny, slender share of the ownership that want control of the whole company, and then have a shakedown for auction prices, basically of fire sale prices in an auction where there's a slight bump in the stock and we've sold off our future and those guys have made the money. Meanwhile, how do they make their money? They don't have any of the performance standards of any of the companies they're targeting. You name your activist fund. Not a single one of them has a board of directors, Charles. Not a single one of them is accountable. And in fact, what kind of compensation do they make? They make 2% right away on the money that you've given them, and then they all make another 20% on the annual gains that year. So they get a little blip in stock by fire sale auction. They've made a fortune, and they sell the carcass off for nothing later. This is awful, and we're letting this happen. You remember Oliver?
So can I jump in there?
I knew we get the pension.
So let me jump in just for a second because I don't disagree with you in terms of the effect. And you just have to talk to Andrew Livers, who, by the way, is an Australian.
I believe he's dual citizen.
He's Australian first.
He was born in Australia.
He wanted to be here, but he couldn't be because he was.
So let me just say, part of the issue here. So I don't agree with the effect. Sorry, I don't disagree with the effect, and I'm fully on your page in terms of the effect. The real question is, what is the cause? And to me, I think institutional investors have to look in the mirror to understand what the cause is. Because the reality is that if, a Pershing capital can control an iconic corporation like DuPont with 2.5% of the shares, where are the other 97.5% owners? And owners is a really, really important word here, because institutional investors, be it pension funds, endowments, et cetera, have to start acting like owners. I'll tell you a little story. That means they have to vote. They can't, as part of their fiduciary responsibility, abdicate their proxy vote to some third party like an ISS or a Glass Lewis. It means they have to act in the fiduciary interest that they have to their beneficiaries. I think the activists are a symptom, not the cause.
Right.
And let me tell you one little anecdote. A large sovereign wealth fund. I was with the leader of the fund, and I was talking about this issue. And this fund probably owns about 3% of the US stock market. And I said, how are you thinking about this issue? I said, do you use one of these proxy advisory firms? Do you use them to do your vote? And he said, no, we don't use proxy advisory firms. And I said, that's great. I'm really glad to hear that you're taking your responsibility seriously. He said, no, we don't vote our shares. And it's a little bit like you get the government you deserve.
And you know what, Mark? You guys used to do that until one day Larry Fink woke up and saw that he had delegated his vote, your vote, at BlackRock
Not
to
our
Lens.
vote, their vote.
Well, their vote.
Their vote.
Yeah, actually, our vote, that you
Correct.
as our agent were delegating that to Lens to vote against Jamie Dimon to be split the ownership between chair and CEO, which Larry thought was preposterous to have as a uniform panacea. It makes sense in certain circumstances. And that's when you guys took it back. But you also were blindly doing that. The only thing I would disagree with what you said, by the way, is it's completely, I think, consistent with my analysis, and I think we're in agreement, is that you happened to mention Pershing, which tried to destroy J.C. Penney, and happily the board reinstated the guy that Pershing forced out, which Bill Ackman had forced out. And of course, Pershing made a mess of Valiant, which is another story. They've lost more than 95% of the owner's capital. But Pershing had nothing to do with DuPont. That, of course, was Nelson Peltz, if we want to, and Treon. And you're right, it was 3% roughly of the ownership that he had there. And yet he brought the board of this great company to its knees. After Ellen Coleman fought back the proxy battle, the shareholders ultimately rallied behind the board and management, as they should have, and with two historic bad quarters, by the way, 266% total shareholder return over her 6 years running the company. We don't know a CEO that you can name that's outside of technology had a better return. Is that 2 bad quarters because of Asia's was off for agricultural chemicals selling into China, and they're making them in Brazil. They lost their nerve and went down the Nelson Peltz, hat in hand, on their knees to beg forgiveness and threw her out. Yeah. You're right, it's the board, but they're responding to you, Charles, because the shareholder pressure told the board to do that.
A little more complicated. Carson, I want to get to you, but I want to answer Jeff.
Just want to get to, it's following up on Mark's point. I really think that the key question there is where were the other 98%? And this is where actually the initiative that we talked about, we really started by looking in the mirror as asset owners. Because the truth is, most asset owners, including the one I represented, kind of have fallen behind the game and really were not active. Many of them did not vote. And so if we want to point to some good news, I think the good news is that if you look at now voting season, if you look at voting activity, you see more investors, let's say the broad range of investors waking up and understanding that, we have to take this seriously. We can't just outsource this to proxy companies. You see initiatives around the world focused on stewardship codes, which basically is a very simple tool. It simply just requires, especially asset owners, just tell us what your policy is on this and how you voted. It doesn't say what you have to do, just be transparent about it. Transparency is a wonderful force. There's the issue about governance around, again, there's a governance around these pools of capital. Who are these governance, who are they accountable to? Let's get them involved also. So there are, I think, a number of very, very positive signs of actually more engagement. And it's fair to say that 10 years ago, there was very little of that. And basically, they left the field open for these guys.
You guys gave me a great lead into our question, so thanks. And in fact, it comes out, it's a question from the audience, interesting enough, but also comes out of, I think, what Mark was saying earlier about quarterly earnings. It's kind of interesting. I mean, you're right that at times, you miss something by a penny and your stock takes a hit. A good board doesn't think about that because the issue isn't what a stock does in a couple of days or weeks. It's over a long term. They're long-term owners. The question, though, this is the important thing. This goes back to your point, Jeff, that why did it fall? Was it because they missed by a penny, or was it because it caused a lack of confidence in the management team? In other words, it wasn't the penny. Was it saying, we think that you've lost something here? Now, in Inouye's case, who's a very good friend, by the way, and on the board of the Weinberg Center.
And her performance towers over Coke's.
And she's done terrifically. She's a great CEO. Now, what happened? She did face a fight. Yet, she was successful. Why? Because of the Black Rocks and everyone else sitting here who said, we believe you over them. In the end, long-term capital won out because she made a compelling argument. And where you lose these things is where you're unable to convince this room that, in fact, it will work. And that, I think, is the question. So I go to the panel, what should we think about quarterly reports? How important, and what is the role of the large-scale investor, who is representing all of us, by the way? And I like your taxi cab driver. That's a good point. Okay. What does it mean? What should y'all be thinking?
Can I start on this one? So quarterly reporting, I think, is something that is extremely important for transparency, and it's important to understand how a company is doing. The challenge comes in with quarterly guidance, which typically means that it is issued by the company itself. So somebody says, well, next quarter we're going to make $1.72 or whatever it is, or consensus. So that is typically when Wall Street analysts come up with a consensus. And I think missing those two things is a little bit different. They're a little bit different from each other. So the way that I think about missing consensus is it's a bit nonsensical. So if you see in the paper, such and such company missed consensus by 10 cents, they had a terrible quarter, right? That's what the article would say. But the analogy I think about is if it's beautiful and sunny outside today and the weather people say it's going to be beautiful and sunny, but it rains, you don't say the sky missed the forecast, right? You say the forecast was wrong. And so I think that's the difference between consensus and guidance, because if it's guidance, you're telling what you're going to do. And if you say you're going to do something, you don't do it, then there is perhaps a credibility problem. So one of the questions that we're working on is, why does somebody give guidance? Why should they give guidance? Many of the best companies have stopped giving guidance, or they give longer-term guidance, or they give broader guidance. We are entering this market, we're doing this. And so our goal is to think about having corporations have a long-term strategic plan, articulate that to their investors, and have some milestones on the way to that strategic plan, because clearly investors want to hold corporate management teams accountable, but not do this quarterly rat race that we've gotten ourselves into.
Anyone else want to grab this one?
Yeah. Quickly, I think we have leading investors here and leading CEOs. I do think it's easy to blame the investors, and the investors, as all of you, both of you said, do need to look in the mirror, and here's the shining examples. It is easy for a CEO to fall in the trap of quarterly. The compensation can be quite attractive in the short term, following the stock price as it goes up, as it just beats guidance each quarter. So I think there is a role for courageous CEOs to step up in a big way, as courageous investors do too, to say exactly what you just said, which I'm not going to play that game. It doesn't mean I don't have to perform,
right,
but my performance is not going to be about the quarter. The performance is going to be about the 266%.
No, those are the ones that get targeted, that do take those longer-term perspectives. And Charles said, well, then the performance is what felled them. No, as you said, PepsiCo's performance, even Ellen Coleman's performance, in the worst of the worst, with these two historically bad quarters in the 230-year history of DuPont or whatever, two bad quarters, even then she towered over Monsanto. Hugh Grant didn't get any in the exact competitive space of agricultural chemicals. She was targeted unfairly in a personal smear campaign that followed. There's something more than just the actual performance. Indra Nooyi, Tim Cook of Apple, Michael Dell, these were very strong, Andrew Liveris, very strong performers, or even Klaus Kleinfeld. And if you really look at the numbers, it's amazing how strong they were. They were driven out not by quarterly performance reports, but I can tell you, and if people want to know the evidence, I can show you. People going to their children's schools, walking to the boys' room and girls' rooms, asking their children for their Facebook accounts, pretending to be fellow classmates. People going into their trash cans. This is honest to God truth. People going door to door with neighbors, saying, aren't the Elsons really noisy people or whatever, is trying to get
I
dirt.
like loud music.
Well, see, he admits it at least. But this kind of a smear campaign has a wilting effect on a normal human being. And that kind of, if the performance were the issue, we wouldn't see these kinds of sleazy PR campaigns. It's because the performance is not the issue, because they're exploiting, way back, Charles, when you were, among others, pioneers of investor activism, it got inverted into activist investors, which is something different, as these are people are the old LBO artists that are exploiting the good governance reform issues you've championed and draped themselves as wolves in that lamb's clothing, and they're out there in the same shakedown campaigns that they did 30 years ago, or they're the disciples of those people. That's the trouble.
But I think, again, you have to ask yourself, they're opportunists. And opportunists show up when they think there's an opportunity. And the question is, why? And they don't win unless they convince the long-term investors that something is wrong. That's their opening, whether it's bad governance or bad performance. But then that's debatable. And the response of a good CEO say, no, let me explain it. And that's, in fact, what happened at Pepsi. I just think, I think...
And yet she was targeted by campaign, and a lot of us went to bat for her. And I'll tell you candidly, and I know we're not off the record, but Alan Coleman is not the kind of person to run to a lot of other people for help. Other people we've talked about here happen to enlist an awful lot of other people to put a spotlight on. Ellen just thought the merits should win, and unfortunately, that wasn't enough.
And that's the value to that CEO of a long-term investor like BlackRock, or the ones that tend to do that. It's actually very similar to the value of a long-term employee versus a short-term employee. People understand how the differential there, and it's the same with a long-term investor versus a short-term investor. You know, it's about conscious capitalism, not quarterly capitalism. Long-term capital gains is what, 1 year? That's not a long-term capital gains. I mean, you know, I mentioned Jim Sinegal earlier. One of the first things he ever told me was, don't care about your stock price for 10 years. The story is that he ran a guy off his board for worrying about the stock price less than 10 years. But even if you get past a quarter, it's usually this year to date, or this year, or the next year to date. And you don't hear a lot of metrics about the last 3 years, or the last 4 years, or the 5 years.
These are frat boy bullies. You know, if anybody on the stage speaks out and takes them on head on, as I have, I'll tell you what's going to happen. You get press time defamation releases, even against inconsequential school teachers. It happens to me, and that stuff is cached on the web's internet sites forever. They make stuff up. They said, Ellen Coleman, I've never taken $1 from, I've never consulted for her, she's not a personal friend, is because he came to speak out in her defense. Bill George and I and others who did from Harvard, we wind up with this nonsense that gets out there in the New York Post and other people saying that we have pay-for-play schemes. We're longtime cronies of theirs. And this is all the other names, too, is that these guys play a very nasty game. And it isn't the efficiency of markets we're looking at. We're looking at pretty nasty slander campaigns. And not a lot of people, as public figures, these CEOs have a hard time battling that, and their boards tell them just suck it up.
But hyperbole in the end is hyperbole, and the investors, the long-term people, recognize that. And that's, in fact, campaigns are very different than they were a few years ago because of that. No one reacts nicely to hyperbole.
And one quick point. I think the problem is, and this is really valid, all great companies see their stock price fall by more than half about twice a decade. So. And that's really true. And so that makes the management team, the long-term, the good family farmer, vulnerable to this syndrome.
Well, I have the wisest of all sitting next to me. You've listened to
The only thing I know more than all of you about is public opinion.
That is true.
And let me tell you, what the professor's saying matters. Perception becomes reality. This doesn't work in terms of all of your investors or even you guys having a chance to go in and determine whether or not this person running this company is not just their performance, but who they are, what their character is. Because a lot of what you look at is whether or not these people have leadership abilities, whether they're real, whether they, and so it matters. I couldn't agree with you more, Professor, that I am out of my depth in being able to make judgments about individual performances on individual CEOs here. And I mean this sincerely. That's why I relied on Jeff so much. He was very successful in his own right, did very, very, very well in the market, and had two very successful companies. But I would rely on Jeff inside the White House for a lot of these judgments about the character of the people. And by the way, when each of these people that we're talking about, for different reasons, end up sitting in the Roosevelt room or the cabinet room when we're dealing with a long-term U.S. economic dilemma and problem, we bring in the people, particularly in the financial markets. And character matters. Character matters. You sit there and you look at that CEO of such and such a financial institution, or it's one of the reasons why, quite frankly, Larry Fink is respected. They look at him and they say, this guy's got character. I will not name other names because they're not in public life in terms of politics, but there are people you know sitting across from you in the room and are not the people you want helping you make fundamental judgments about. And we went through, by the way, folks, it's hard to remember, thank God. My mother used to say the greatest gift God gave mankind was the ability to forget. And then she looks and says, otherwise women would only have one child. But, but all kidding aside, you know, we were not just on the balls of our heels. We were flat on our back when we came into office. We were in the worst recession in history, short of a depression, and it was a financial recession of consequence. And so, you know, all these folks came in. That we went out and picked out. I don't think of the Fortune 500 CEOs. We probably talked to every one of them at some point and got them engaged. And character matters. Character matters. So I really do think these campaigns are as targeted as they are in politics.
Right.
They're as targeted as the dirty politics that exist within our system now. And I don't think you can just, again, I don't know enough, and I'll stop. I don't know enough to know what precise impact they've had internally and how that affects your decision as an owner, et cetera. But I can't, you know, all this gets down to whether or not you have a pretty good insight to human nature. You know, Emerson said, society's like a wave. The wave moves on, but the particles remain the same. God ain't made a new brand of woman. Greed has not changed. The way in which self-serving operates has not changed, the way it's hidden. I mean, so it is, you guys are in a rough game. And so the only point I'll make and end is it matters. And I know, Professor, they go after you as to whether or not you have, you know, you consult for her? Do you do? I mean, that's.
And these are very deep-pocketed people that some of them have.
I know. This is not your page 6 New York report, you know, reporter. This is somebody with very deep pockets talking to that person. Anyway.
You know.
Can I bring up one just to, because I think public policy is an interesting part of this, and you asked what is the role of public policy, and it's not obvious, except in one area. In one area. And the one area, and I think it's very hard to debate this, which is we need to do something, not just in this country, but globally, about financial literacy. And if there's one place to start from a public policy perspective, it is enhancing financial literacy for those people who are the ultimate owners of these corporations.
I think that's true.
And I think if we wanted to pick, you know, we could pick apart, we could maybe change the incentives a little bit by changing the nature of long-term capital gains and making some tweaks to the tax system, or thinking about how we should control incentive compensation, et cetera, all of which may be important. But the number one thing that we need to think about is how do we improve financial literacy for those that own the economy? Because I think, in my view, if we can do that, starting not on university campuses, but before, in high school, in elementary school. So people aren't afraid about numbers and aren't afraid about understanding finances. Then the owners can actually take control back at the ultimate level. So I would start there. I want to answer that question.
That was your policy, I think,
I think that's fabulous. It's very long-term, and it's right answer. Right answer. There is a disconnect, however, in that, again, with the exceptions on this stage, why are your peers around the country not taking responsibility now?
Good for you, Jeff. Not only is your first name right, but so is everything you say. Let's start at the top. I think, who in their right mind would come to a college campus and argue against education, right? So, Jeff, we can't say what we're thinking, which is that let's educate the financiers about finance first. Since 2/3 of the control is from the institutions, shouldn't we educate the institutions? Because this average investor they don't have control over it.
Let me ask we're running out of time. There's an important academic question I want to ask. And so I want you all to put your thinking caps on. By the way, I've been on both sides of that as well, as have you, and have had the nasty stuff said too. But what I did discover...
You have been courageous, Charles.
No.
Charles has, things that have happened to companies from Sunbeam to HealthSouth and others, Charles has been a very heroic change agent.
Thank you. But I've always thought...
Although his father was the ambassador to Denmark, and we'll hear about the Danish slur in the beginning.
Yeah, he didn't think very much. But ultimately, in the end, the voting was rational, I've always thought. And regardless of how it came out, in the end, ignoring the hyperbole, when you had to sit down and figure it out, I always thought the institution did the right thing. And I still believe that. But here's the question. This is a tough one. Ready? This is a good economics 101. And by the way, y'all who asked the questions, this is what, we have a really good panel. You answer all the questions you get, so the panel did it. So if you heard it, but you didn't hear it in the way you wrote it, you heard it. Because they did. Here we go. If the goal of a short-term investor is to temporarily increase the share price, for this to occur, someone is buying the stock with the idea that it ultimately will appreciate in the future. If the increase is truly short-term, why would anyone buy?
Compensation.
Overconfidence. So I think that one of the things we see time and again is that there's a difference between the continuing shareholder and a short-term shareholder. And there was actually a study published just a few weeks ago by Dalbar that showed the difference between what the average equity mutual fund investor earns and what the S&P 500 has earned. And over the last 30 years, the S&P has earned 10.4%, and the average equity investor investing supposedly in that has earned 3.7%. And that's just a massive difference. And think about how that compounds over time. And part of that is fees that people are paying, but it's a relatively small part. The largest part of that is buying high and selling low and having a pro-cyclical short-term mindset and just giving that money away. Nobody, that is just a loss. So I think that comes from overconfidence, fear, lack of understanding of financial markets, and that is, it's a shame, really, that you've lost that so much money.
Can I ask a dumb question for a guy who didn't do well in 101? The studies that have been presented to me and that I've read in the White House and as well as since then, is that of the 448 or 60 Fortune 500 companies who've been in the Fortune 500 for the last 10 years, roughly, they've made about $2.6 or $7 trillion, which is a good thing. Yet they've spent 55% of that profit to buy back their own stock. Now, it seems to me the market incentivizes things to happen. If I'm a CEO and you limit my salary as deductible only up to $1 million, and now you have most CEOs being paid the bulk of their salaries as a consequence of the stock that they had, why wouldn't you go out and buy back your stock? That in and of itself raises the share value, almost every circumstance, the value of each share. And then another 23 or 28%, normally the exact number, goes out in dividends, leaving 9% for everything else, from from investment to workers to retraining. So, what is, does that matter? Does that statistic matter?
You have it's interesting you raise that, because I was at a conference at Penn, it's your other school, and someone raised that just that question, and there was a paper that was presented, and they said, actually, this is really interesting, that much of the stock that's bought back is bought back to use to fund employee stock plans. In other words, it's recycled. It goes from the shareholders back to the company, to the employees, who ultimately resell it to the public. It was a really interesting number, and I never
It's a neat argument, except it's wrong.
Well, I didn't write it. I just heard it.
And the reality is that last year in this country, over 97% of corporate profits were effectively paid back in the form of share buybacks or dividends. Say that again. 97% of all profits in this country of public corporations were given back in the form of share buybacks or dividends, instead of being reinvested in the company for productive value creation.
That's different than the Bailey Savings and Loan, isn't it? You know, so
do you have the data to debunk
it's a wonderful life.
this neat packaging of that? There's absolutely no way a significant portion of that 97% goes to employee stock plans.
No.
But even if it does, to me, there are two different issues. One is how does somebody want to compensate their employees, and how do you account for that? You can give your employees stock options, and you can run that through your income statement, or you can do buybacks, and they are very different issues. And so the question with buybacks is, how many management teams stand up and say, I'm going to buy back my shares because I'm out of ideas. I have no productive ideas to invest in. That's not what CEOs say, but that's essentially what they are saying when they use their money.
Well, it's a knowing versus doing conundrum. Most corporate leaders know the right thing to do.
That's right.
But they're not doing it. Some of it's the issues that Jeff put out. I think a lot of it is the way that boards operate. If you go today and you think about it, and you are a CEO and you tell your board, you know, instead of giving that money back to shareholders, I have this great new idea. I want to move into a new market, but we're not going to see a return on that investment for a decade. How many boards would approve that project?
More than you think.
But the reality is fewer than need to.
Fewer than fewer. DuPont would have done it when the DuPont family and Christiana Securities backed them through most of their history. Ford Motor Company could do it because of the patient family capital of Class B that Charles and other governistas don't like. It gives them the Walton family of Walmart gives them the base to do that. And Michael Dell is the only integrated information technology company left here, because IBM and Hewlett-Packard and others have disintegrated, as their CEOs will tell you.
And by the way, Ellen just went on his board.
Yeah, they felt they've had to do this. Right, they've had to do this. But as a private company, they're willing to take those long-term bets if they have that protection, and it's a bit of a condemnation of rapacious nature of short-term capitalism.
Amazon does that, maybe not a decade, but very visibly they do it.
Amazon has different rules. They don't have to be profitable.
So, yeah.
But ultimately, even if you buy the stock back, the money goes somewhere, and often, or a dividend, and it usually goes into other ventures. In other words, it goes to build other companies. That's where the money comes from, to create new companies, to create new ideas.
But what evidence is that there? Because the growth has not been anything like you're implying it is. Well, I don't get that. I mean, I look at the macroeconomic impact of this, and how many new companies are coming up, and how much is being invested, and how much is sitting in the stock market.
40% of retail accounts in this country today are in cash.
But look at
they're not being invested.
But most of the investments today are in your pension, your retirement funds, and your mutual funds, and they get reinvested. I mean, think of it this way. Look at the Fortune 500 today, and look at it 30 years ago. It's unrecognizable. They've just, because ideas change. Businesses are living creatures in a weird way. They evolve, and either they evolve successfully or they don't. And if they don't, then someone sells them and takes the assets and puts them to something good somewhere else. Look at all the new companies that have come, the billions of dollars in value that have been created for all of us, because we're all invested in this stuff, if you think about it, in the last 10 years.
From private
capital. When you were, during your term, a lot of great things happened.
From private capital, like most of the history of this country until the interwar years, it was family dynastic capital. is Alfred Lord Chandler, the great historian of DuPont and elsewhere, had said that before the interwar years, you could fit every salaried manager in DuPont's present headquarters with their own office. That it became the Pennsylvania Railroad, those were the exceptions, that actually family dynastic capital was
But Jeff, private capital is the institutional investors. It's CalPERS, it's TI-CREF. Who do you think invested in those things?
No, but
That's where the money comes from.
Can I make just a comment on that? So there's been a lot of press, of course, about the unicorns, you know, companies that are getting to be very big, the Ubers of the world, right? They're getting to be very large companies and not going public.
Right.
And one of the reasons I was in California this week, and the lore in Silicon Valley is you don't want to go public because once you do, the short-term pressure of the market will make it very hard for you to innovate. And it is true that the CalPERS of the world can invest in those, but you have to be a qualified purchaser to invest in those companies. And so essentially what that means is that large institutions and wealthy individuals can invest in those companies. But in your average 401k plan or a retail account, you cannot. And so that is not the right answer for our society if only the institutions and wealthy individuals can invest in the innovative companies and regular people can only invest in big, boring companies.
And so
that's not a
you're
good,
right,
that's
and
not a good answer.
it's even a bigger problem because the most efficient and cheapest way for a new venture to raise capital is the public market. So if we don't figure this out, and we don't have an efficiently operating public market, then we've got much.
But they don't want to do it like Sarah says.
They don't want. They don't want to do it for exactly the reason.
Sarah was
But that's why.
once again you get an A. Sarah was one of my best students ever 100 years ago at the Harvard Business School.
Thanks.
It was okay. It was only 1989.
Yeah, just keep going with your point.
All right.
You might want to rephrase that.
But she did very well. Is the idea is that private equity firms, their portfolio managers, you go off on a retreat with them. They used to always be like, you know, Prometheus wanting to be set free. Now they'll say, we don't want to be set free from the private equity firm controlling us. We want to stay private. No CEOs wanted to stay private before. Now they all do, and it isn't Sarbanes-Oxley. It's because of the rapacious nature of this activist investor.
We are already there. Do you know who was the most significant investor in the Enron Raptors and the thing that blew up Enron? CalPERS. It was CalPERS money. And who's CalPERS? In other words, we're all in this together. And I think that it's, you know, what's the old, we say in the law business, it's a distinction without a difference sometimes. That we're distinguishing it, but in the end, we're all here. I'm trying to bring this together because I promised we'd be at 2 o'clock.
They also say in the law business, sunlight's the best disinfectant. But go ahead.
Absolutely. And transparency is a critical part of the system. And that's what we're missing, I believe, and I think all of us in this system. Transparency, if you don't want to see it on the front page of the New York Times, you shouldn't say it.
If I'm going to get people of this
Last
caliber
word.
to come back for free, which Dr. Sanas tells me they all have to be for free, what I'm going to have to do is keep my commitment, and I promise them, because they have places to go and planes and trains to catch, that they all be out of here by 2 o'clock. There's 2 minutes left to go. I hope there are a lot of students in here. I hope you all found this interesting, and we will be following up on this. So thank you all very, very much. Appreciate it.
You know, our next CEO summit.